Chapter 1. The Prize-Winning Pattern. The annual St. Mary Mead knitting competition was always a highlight of the village calendar, but this year's event had generated an unprecedented excitement. The reason for this particular enthusiasm could be attributed to the presence of Lady Amelia Westbrook, the renowned knitting expert, who had graciously agreed to serve as head judge. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her favourite armchair by the window of her cottage, carefully set aside her own knitting as she prepared to leave for the village hall. Though an accomplished knitter herself, her nephew Raymond often praised her delicate lacework. She had chosen this year to serve on the organising committee rather than compete. It suited her temperament far better to observe than to be observed, and there was always so much one could learn from watching others. The hall was already crowded when Miss Marple arrived, her sharp blue eyes taking in the nervous contestants making last-minute adjustments to their displays. The competition pieces were arranged on long tables draped in white cloth, each entry accompanied by a small card bearing the creator's name and category. Cardigans competed with christening shawls, tea cozies with elaborate Afghan blankets, and in the centre of it all, the pièce de résistance category, original lacework. "Jane, dear." "There you are," called Mrs. Bantry, bustling over with her usual energy. "Have you seen Letitia Blackwell's face? She looks ready to murder someone if she doesn't win this year. 5 consecutive victories have rather gone to her head, I'm afraid." Miss Marple glanced toward Miss Blackwell, noting the rigid set of her shoulders and the way her fingers kept returning to smooth imaginary wrinkles from her own entry. A traditional shawl in cream wool, its pattern clearly derived from old Shetland designs. "Pride often comes before a fall," Miss Marple observed mildly, "though I must say, her work is technically flawless." The ceremony began promptly at 3 o'clock. Lady Westbrook, an elegant woman in her 60s with perfectly coiffed silver hair, moved among the entries with practiced authority. She examined each piece through a jeweller's loupe, occasionally making notes in a leather-bound book. The spectators maintained a respectful silence, broken only by occasional whispers and the rustle of fabric as people shifted for better views. When Lady Westbrook finally approached the microphone, the tension in the room was palpable. She announced the winners in the minor categories first, Mrs. Price for her cheerful tea, cozy, young Jennifer Martin for her first attempt at a baby blanket, before pausing dramatically. "And now, for our premier category, original lacework. This year, we have a truly exceptional winner. The piece demonstrates not merely technical proficiency, but genuine innovation in design. Ladies and gentlemen, the first prize goes to Mrs. Eliza Hartley for her exquisite lace shawl, featuring what I can only describe as a revolutionary technique." The announcement was met with scattered applause and more than a few gasps of surprise. Mrs. Hartley, a woman perhaps in her late 40s with prematurely grey hair and nervous hands, approached the podium with obvious reluctance. As she accepted her prize, a silver cup and a certificate, Miss Marple noticed something curious. The winner appeared more relieved than pleased, her smile fixed and uncomfortable. Miss Blackwell's reaction was less restrained. Her face flushed an unbecoming shade of red, and she pushed through the crowd to examine the winning shawl more closely. Her expression shifted from anger to confusion as she studied the intricate pattern. During the tea reception that followed, Miss Marple positioned herself near the refreshment table, an excellent vantage point for observation. She watched as Lady Westbrook engaged Mrs. Hartley in what appeared to be an intense private conversation, their heads bent close together. At one point, Lady Westbrook gestured animatedly while Mrs. Hartley shook her head repeatedly. "Extraordinary piece of work," Colonel Bantry remarked, joining Miss Marple with a cup of tea. "Though I can't make head or tail of it myself. All looks like tangles to me." "The pattern is quite unique," Miss Marple agreed. I've never seen anything quite like it, though there's something familiar about the basic structure. As the afternoon wore on, Mrs. Hartley approached Miss Marple with hesitant steps. Miss Marple? I wonder if I might speak with you tomorrow about a matter of some delicacy. I've heard you have a reputation for discretion. Of course, my dear. Shall we say 11 o'clock? I'll have coffee ready. Before Mrs. Hartley could respond, Lady Westbrook appeared at her elbow. Mrs. Hartley, we really must discuss the publication rights for your pattern. Such innovative work deserves wider recognition. Mrs. Hartley allowed herself to be led away, casting an apologetic glance over her shoulder at Miss Marple. That evening, as Miss Marple returned to her cottage in the gathering dusk, she discovered an envelope had been pushed under her door. Inside was a torn page from what appeared to be a knitting journal dated 1938. The pattern depicted was remarkably similar to Mrs. Hartley's winning design, though simpler in execution. A note in spidery handwriting accompanied it. Nothing new under the sun. Beware of old wounds reopened. Miss Marple studied the page thoughtfully before placing it on her mantelpiece. Outside, the evening birds were settling in for the night, their calls gradually fading into silence. In the distance, the church clock struck 8, its familiar chime a comforting reminder of the rhythms of village life. Yet as she picked up her own knitting, the clicking of her needles seemed to echo with questions. Who had sent the mysterious page? What old wounds were being reopened? And why had Mrs. Hartley seemed so troubled by her victory? The answers, Miss Marple suspected, lay tangled somewhere in the intricate stitches of that prize-winning shawl, a pattern that might reveal far more than its creator had intended. Chapter 2. Jealousy Among Competitors. The following morning dawned bright and clear, a perfect spring day in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple had risen early, as was her custom, and by 10 o'clock had already tended to her garden and prepared a tray of coffee and biscuits for her expected visitor. She arranged her sitting room with care, positioning 2 chairs by the window where the morning light would fall pleasantly without being too bright. 11 o'clock came and went, with no sign of Mrs. Hartley. By past, Miss Marple's natural concern prompted action. She covered the coffee pot with a cosy, pulled on her second-best hat, and set off toward Lilac Cottage, where she knew Mrs. Hartley had taken rooms. The cottage stood at the end of the high street, its namesake lilacs not yet in bloom, but promising purple glory come May. Mrs. Finch, the landlady, answered Miss Marple's knock with flour-dusted hands and a harried expression. "Oh, Miss Marple, I'm afraid you've just missed her. Mrs. Hartley left at dawn, said there was a family emergency. Packed up everything in such a rush, she barely had time for a cup of tea." "How very sudden," Miss Marple observed. "Did she happen to mention the nature of the emergency?" "Not a word, though she did seem terribly agitated. Kept looking over her shoulder as if expecting someone. And would you believe she took that prize-winning shawl with her? It was meant to be displayed in the village hall all week." This last piece of information was particularly intriguing. As Miss Marple made her way to the village hall, she encountered several groups of villagers engaged in animated discussion. News of Mrs. Hartley's departure had spread with the swiftness peculiar to small communities. "Mark my words," Miss Blackwell's strident voice carried across the green. "That woman was a fraud. Ran off before anyone could properly examine her so-called revolutionary pattern." Inside the hall, the competition display remained intact, save for the conspicuous empty space where the winning shawl should have been. The silver cup sat forlornly on its pedestal, the winner's name still gleaming on the newly engraved plate. Miss Marple's next stop was the vicarage, where Mrs. Clement maintained an extensive collection of knitting publications dating back to the early part of the century. The vicar's wife, a cheerful woman whose enthusiasm for needlecraft was matched only by her devotion to parish work, welcomed Miss Marple into her cluttered study. "That pattern you showed me yesterday?" Miss Marple began, producing the torn page from her handbag. "I wondered if you might help me trace its origin." Mrs. Clement adjusted her spectacles and examined the page carefully. "Goodness, this takes me back. Yes, I believe I have the complete journal." She rummaged through several boxes before triumphantly producing a bound volume. "Here we are! Needlecraft Monthly, 1938. The pattern was created by a Miss E. Montgomery for a competition sponsored by Woolcraft Limited. They went out of business during the war, I believe." Miss Marple studied the full pattern with interest. The similarity to Mrs. Hartley's design was unmistakable, though the modern version showed considerably more sophistication in execution. "E. Montgomery," she mused. "The name seems familiar somehow." That afternoon, Miss Marple encountered Lady Westbrook taking tea at the Blue Boar Inn. The judge appeared preoccupied, stirring her Earl Grey with mechanical precision. "Such a disappointment about Mrs. Hartley," Miss Marple ventured, taking the adjacent table. "Her pattern showed such promise." "Mere coincidence," Lady Westbrook replied sharply when Miss Marple mentioned the 1938 design. "Basic techniques often produce similar results. If we investigated every pattern's ancestry, we'd never award a prize for originality." Yet Miss Marple noticed how the judge's hands trembled slightly as she returned the pattern page, and how quickly she excused herself thereafter. The breakthrough came unexpectedly during dinner at the Bantries. Colonel Bantry, helping himself to roast lamb, suddenly looked up from his plate. "Montgomery, you said? Dolly, didn't your cousin in Yorkshire know a Montgomery family? Something about a textile mill and a frightful scandal?" Mrs. Bantry's eyes lit with recollection. "Why, yes. The Montgomery mill. They produced the finest wool in the county before the war. Then there was some terrible business about embezzlement, and the whole enterprise collapsed. The family name was quite ruined." Miss Marple was contemplating these revelations over her evening cocoa when the telephone rang. The voice on the other end was breathless, speaking in rushed whispers. "Miss Marple? This is Eliza Hartley. I'm at York Station. I've made a terrible mistake. The pattern wasn't mine to submit. I never thought she would be there. I never thought anyone would recognize." The line went dead with an abrupt click. Unable to sleep, Miss Marple spent the small hours reviewing what she knew: the stolen pattern, the hasty departure, the family scandal. Threads of a story were beginning to form, though the overall design remained unclear. Morning brought disturbing news. Someone had broken into the village hall during the night. The competition display lay in ruins, photographs of the winning shawl torn to pieces, and in the center of the destruction, a ball of red wool pierced through with knitting needles. "It's an old Yorkshire curse," explained Miss Weatherby, who had arrived early to practice the organ. "My grandmother spoke of it. A warning to those who steal another's work. The red wool represents blood debt." Inspector Slack arrived from Much Benham to investigate the vandalism. A tall, impatient man who barely concealed his disdain for elderly lady detectives, he nevertheless listened to Miss Marple's account of recent events. "So we have a winner who flees in the night, a pattern that may or may not be stolen, and now this theatrical vandalism," he summarized with obvious skepticism. "Hardly seems worth the division's time." "Perhaps not," Miss Marple agreed mildly, "though in my experience, Inspector, the most interesting crimes often begin with the smallest irregularities." As the day progressed, the village buzzed with speculation. Miss Blackwell held court in the post office, her theory of plagiarism gaining supporters. Others suggested Mrs. Hartley had fled creditors or an unhappy marriage. Only Miss Marple, examining the destroyed display with careful attention, noticed the small detail that others had overlooked. Among the scattered needles and torn photographs lay a single snippet of paper bearing 3 words in Mrs. Hartley's distinctive handwriting: "She knows everything." The afternoon post brought another surprise. A telegram from York, brief and unsigned. "Montgomery ghosts walk again. Guard the living from the dead." Miss Marple folded the telegram carefully and placed it with the growing collection of clues on her mantelpiece. Outside, clouds were gathering over St. Mary Mead, and the first drops of rain began to fall. Somewhere between Yorkshire and this quiet village, she sensed, a storm of quite a different nature was brewing, one that would require all her powers of observation to weather. As she took up her knitting once more, the familiar rhythm of needles clicking helped organize her thoughts. Pattern and variation, mistakes and corrections, dropped stitches and careful repairs. Knitting and human nature had much in common. Both followed certain rules, and both could unravel disastrously when those rules were broken. The question now was not merely who had sent the warning or why Mrs. Hartley had fled, but what connection bound the present mystery to a decades-old scandal. Like tracing a pattern back to its source, Miss Marple knew she would need to follow each thread carefully, no matter how tangled the skein might appear. Chapter 3. The Poisoned Tea. The tranquillity of St. Mary Mead was shattered on Tuesday morning by the urgent clanging of Dr. Haydock's motor-car horn as it raced through the high street toward the Blue Boar Inn. Miss Marple, who had been selecting runner beans at the greengrocer's, observed the doctor's haste with growing concern. Such urgency from the usually composed physician could only mean serious trouble. Within the hour, news had spread through the village like wildfire. Lady Westbrook had been found unconscious in her room, the victim of what appeared to be poisoning. The chambermaid, arriving with fresh towels, had discovered the judge collapsed beside her writing desk, an overturned teacup spreading its contents across the morning's correspondence. By the time Miss Marple arrived at the Blue Boar, a small crowd had gathered outside. Inspector Slack's official car was parked at an awkward angle, suggesting he had arrived in considerable haste. Miss Marple made her way through the onlookers and approached Constable Polk, who stood guard at the entrance. "A bad business, Miss Marple?" the constable confided. "Dr. Haydock says it's foxglove poisoning. Touch and go whether she'll pull through." Inside, the inn's usually cheerful atmosphere had given way to hushed anxiety. Mr. Holbrook, the proprietor, wrung his hands as Inspector Slack questioned the staff in the parlour. Miss Marple, unnoticed in the confusion, slipped quietly up the stairs to the first floor. Lady Westbrook's room had been sealed, but through the partially open door, Miss Marple could see the scene of the incident. The elegant sitting-room portion of the suite was in disarray, not from any struggle, but from the medical emergency that had unfolded. The writing desk bore the stains of spilled tea, and curiously, 2 cups sat on the small table by the window. "Miss Marple," Inspector Slack's voice rang out sharply, "this is a crime scene. You can't be here." "Of course, Inspector. I merely wanted to offer any assistance I could. Lady Westbrook was, after all, a guest in our village." Slack's expression softened marginally. "Dr. Haydock managed to stabilize her, but she's still unconscious. We found foxglove extract in the teapot. Enough to kill a horse. Whoever did this meant business." "2 cups," Miss Marple observed quietly. "What's that?" "There are 2 cups on the table. Lady Westbrook was expecting someone." Slack consulted his notebook. "The maid says her ladyship ordered tea for 2 at 9 o'clock, but gave no name. No one saw who visited her." As they spoke, Miss Marple's keen eyes swept the room. A knitting bag, not the elegant leather one Lady Westbrook had carried at the competition, sat partially concealed behind a chair. It was a practical canvas bag, well worn and familiar somehow. "Inspector," she ventured, "might I look at that knitting bag?" With obvious reluctance, Slack permitted her to examine it. Inside, Miss Marple found a half-finished piece worked in the same distinctive stitch pattern as Mrs. Hartley's winning shawl. More significantly, tucked into an inner pocket, was a train ticket stub from York to Much Benham, dated the previous day. The investigation's focus quickly turned to Miss Blackwell, whose animosity toward both judge and winner was well known. Her garden, as several villagers eagerly pointed out, contained abundant foxglove plants, and she had been seen near the Blue Boar early that morning. Miss Marple, however, felt compelled to visit Miss Blackwell herself. She found the woman in her greenhouse, viciously deadheading roses with more force than strictly necessary. "I suppose you've come to accuse me too," Miss Blackwell said without preamble. "Yes, I have foxglove in my garden. So does half the village. And yes, I was angry about the competition. But I'm not a murderess." "I didn't think you were," Miss Marple replied mildly. "But I wondered if you might tell me more about the pattern that won. You seemed to recognize it." Miss Blackwell's hands stilled. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, setting down her secateurs, she turned to face Miss Marple directly. "I served my apprenticeship at Montgomery Mills before the war. I was just a girl, but I remember that pattern. Miss Elizabeth designed it, called it the twin stitch because she and her sister Eleanor worked on it together. It was meant to save the mill." "What happened?" "There was a terrible row with their business partner, accusations of theft, embezzlement. The pattern disappeared along with the mill's assets. Elizabeth swore someone had stolen her life's work. She died in 1945, still trying to prove it. And Eleanor vanished after her sister's death. Some said she went abroad. Others thought, well, there were rumors she might have been involved in the theft herself. The twins were close, but money can divide even the strongest bonds." That evening, as Dr. Haydock reported Lady Westbrook's condition improving, Miss Marple sat in her cottage examining the competition entry forms. Mrs. Hartley's signature caught her attention. Certain letters formed with distinctive flourishes that seemed familiar. Comparing it to the signature on the 1938 pattern, she noted similarities that suggested not identity, but kinship. The same family hand, perhaps, passed down through generations. The hotel register at the Blue Boar yielded another clue. A Miss E. Montgomery had inquired about Lady Westbrook's room number the previous day, but had not checked in. The desk clerk remembered her vaguely. A woman of middle years, well-dressed but nervous, who had left quickly upon learning Lady Westbrook was out. As night fell over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple pieced together the fragments of information. The poisoning attempt, the 2 cups, the mysterious visitor, the old pattern come to life again. All pointed to a carefully planned confrontation that had gone terribly wrong. The next morning brought a breakthrough. Lady Westbrook, finally conscious though weak, refused to name her attacker. Instead, she insisted to Inspector Slack that she must have accidentally used foxglove leaves instead of tea, an explanation that satisfied neither the inspector nor Dr. Haydock. "Preposterous," the doctor declared to Miss Marple later. "She's protecting someone. But who? And why?" Miss Marple thought of the train ticket from York, the familiar pattern worked in unfamiliar hands, and the signature that echoed across decades. "Perhaps," she suggested carefully, "Lady Westbrook feels responsible for something that happened long ago. Guilt, Dr. Haydock, can make people do extraordinary things." That afternoon, While Inspector Slack pursued his investigation of Miss Blackwell's movements, Miss Marple made a series of telephone calls. By evening, she had confirmed several crucial facts. Montgomery Mills had indeed failed in 1944 following accusations of embezzlement. Elizabeth Montgomery had died in 1945, reportedly of a broken heart. And the business partner who profited from the Mills collapse had been named Harold Westbrook. The final piece of the puzzle arrived with the Evening Post, a telegram from her nephew Raymond, who had connections in Yorkshire. Eleanor Montgomery alive, living as E. Hartley near Harrogate. Daughter named Eliza, born 1975. Miss Marple set down the telegram with a thoughtful expression. So Mrs. Hartley was Elizabeth Montgomery's great-niece, carrying on a family tradition, and perhaps a family vendetta. But if Eleanor was alive, who had visited Lady Westbrook that morning? And why had the judge chosen to protect her attacker? As she prepared for bed, Miss Marple reflected on the nature of patterns, how they could be passed down through generations, altered slightly, but retaining their essential character. Like family traits or old grievances, some designs seemed destined to repeat themselves, no matter how much time had passed. Tomorrow, she decided, she would need to have a frank conversation with Lady Westbrook. The truth about the poisoned tea might well lie buried in the events of 1944, when a revolutionary knitting pattern disappeared, and with it, the hopes of the Montgomery family. But first, the judge would have to admit what Miss Marple had already surmised, that the morning visitor had been none other than Eleanor Montgomery herself, come to settle accounts after 40 years of silence. Chapter 4. Missing Wool Evidence. The morning mist hung low over St. Mary Mead, as Miss Marple set out to trace Mrs. Hartley's movements before her hasty departure. The village postmistress, Miss Hartnell, proved an invaluable source of information, her natural curiosity having served her well in observing the comings and goings of all residents, temporary or permanent. Oh yes, Miss Marple. That Mrs. Hartley received quite a number of packages during her stay. Always from Yorkshire they were. Bradley and Sons, specialist wool suppliers. I noticed because my sister lives near their shop in Skipton. The last package arrived just 3 days before the competition. How interesting, Miss Marple mused. Did you happen to notice anything unusual about these deliveries? Well, now that you mention it, the final package was different, heavier than the others, and marked fragile, historical materials. She seemed quite anxious about it, came to collect it herself rather than waiting for the afternoon delivery. Inspector Slack, meanwhile, had been pursuing his own inquiries. His investigation had revealed that no one named Eliza Hartley appeared in any recent electoral registers or official documents dating back 5 years. The identity, it seemed, was as carefully crafted as the prize-winning shawl itself. Miss Marple's next stop was Woolly Thoughts, the village yarn shop run by Mrs. Bennet, a cheerful woman whose passion for fibre crafts was matched only by her encyclopedic knowledge of traditional techniques. The shop, with its rainbow walls of yarn and comfortable chairs where local knitters gathered, had been Mrs. Hartley's regular haunt during her stay. Such an interesting lady, Mrs. Bennet recalled, winding a skein of mohair. Very knowledgeable about historical wool production. She asked the most specific questions about pre-war dyeing techniques, wanted to know about natural mordants and how to achieve certain shades that aren't possible with modern synthetic dyes. Did she purchase supplies for her competition entry here? Indeed she did. I remember exactly because she was so particular. She needed a specific weight of wool, 4-ply in natural cream, and size 3 needles. Said she was working from an old family pattern that required traditional materials. Mrs. Bennet produced her sales ledger, running her finger down the entries. Here we are, She bought exactly enough for a large shawl, plus a bit extra. What struck me as odd was her insistence on undyed wool. Must be exactly as it would have been in 1938, she said. I thought it rather strange at the time. Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Bennet and made her way back to Lilac Cottage, hoping to speak with Mrs. Finch again. The landlady was in the midst of spring cleaning, but welcomed Miss Marple into her sitting room. I've been tidying Mrs. Hartley's room for the next lodger, she explained, wiping her hands on her apron. Would you believe someone broke in last night? Nothing taken, mind you, but the place was turned upside down. How very peculiar. May I see the room? Mrs. Finch led the way upstairs. The small bedroom, though recently searched, retained traces of its former occupant. As Miss Marple examined the space, her attention was drawn to a small ball of wool that had rolled under the wardrobe. The colour was unusual, a deep indigo that seemed to shift between blue and purple in the light. I've never seen yarn quite like this, Miss Marple observed, holding it up to the window. The dye has an almost iridescent quality. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple placed the mysterious wool beside her other clues. Its unusual colour nagged at her memory, until, consulting one of her nephew's books on textile history, she found what she was looking for. Woad-based indigo dyes, when combined with certain mineral mordants unique to Yorkshire water, produced a characteristic blue-purple that cannot be replicated with modern techniques. That afternoon, Dr. Haydock called with news about Lady Westbrook. She's well enough to receive visitors now, but she's being remarkably evasive about the whole affair. Claims she can't remember anything about that morning, which, medically speaking, is highly unlikely. Perhaps her memory is selective rather than impaired, Miss Marple suggested. Sometimes people choose to forget what they find too painful to remember. When Miss Marple arrived at the Blue Boar, she found Lady Westbrook sitting up in bed, her colour much improved, though her manner remained guarded. The judge received her visitor with polite wariness. I suppose you want to ask about the poisoning? Lady Westbrook began. I've told Inspector Slack everything I remember, which is precious little. Actually, Miss Marple replied, settling into the bedside chair. I wanted to ask about your father. Harold Westbrook, wasn't it? He had business interests in Yorkshire before the war. The change in Lady Westbrook's expression was subtle but unmistakable. My father has been dead for 15 years. I fail to see what relevance. He was involved with Montgomery Mills, I believe, during the war years. Lady Westbrook's hands tightened on the coverlet. Ancient history. The business failed, as many did during those difficult times. Yet here we are, all these years later, with a Montgomery pattern winning your competition. Rather an extraordinary coincidence. Patterns are revived all the time in the knitting world. Vintage designs are quite fashionable. Miss Marple produced the ball of indigo wool. This was found in Mrs. Hartley's room. The colour is quite distinctive. Yorkshire woad, I believe. The same dye process used at Montgomery Mills. For a long moment, Lady Westbrook said nothing. Then, with a sigh that seemed to come from somewhere deep within, she began to speak. I recognized the pattern immediately. The twin stitch, Elizabeth Montgomery's masterpiece. My father acquired it along with other assets when the mill failed. He always claimed it was a legitimate business transaction, but I knew better. I was young then, working at Needlecraft Monthly. I saw the original pattern notes, saw Elizabeth's signature. When father submitted it for publication under a false name, I said nothing. And Mrs. Hartley? I recognized her too. She has Eleanor's eyes, the same way of holding her needles. When she submitted that pattern, using the traditional twin stitch but elaborated with modern techniques, I knew it was a message. The Montgomerys were reclaiming what was theirs. Who visited you that morning, Lady Westbrook? I was expecting Eliza, Mrs. Hartley. We were going to discuss the patent rights, try to make some amends for past wrongs. But the woman who came to my room, she was older, with grey hair and those same Montgomery eyes. She said, "I'm Eleanor Montgomery, and I've waited 40 years for this moment." She poisoned your tea? She poured the tea, yes, but I don't think... That is, when I began to feel ill, she seemed genuinely frightened. She kept saying it wasn't supposed to happen this way. Then she fled. Miss Marple considered this. And you chose to protect her by claiming it was an accident. What else could I do? My family ruined hers. My father's theft drove Elizabeth to her grave and Eleanor into exile. If I'd told the truth, Eleanor would be arrested for attempted murder. Haven't the Montgomerys suffered enough? That evening, Inspector Slack reported a development. The telephone call Miss Marple had received from Mrs. Hartley had indeed been traced to York Station, but security cameras showed no one matching her description had boarded any train. Instead, she had been seen entering a small hotel near the station. Miss Marple, studying the ball of indigo wool, made a decision. "Inspector, I believe we need to examine the contents of that storage box at York Station. The key is hidden in this wool." Carefully unwinding the ball, she revealed not only a small brass key, but also a note. "Box 17, York Station. The truth about the twin stitch." With Inspector Slack's reluctant agreement, arrangements were made through the Yorkshire Police to access the storage box. Colonel Bantry, with his connections to the local constabulary, volunteered to oversee the operation. Late that evening, Colonel Bantry telephoned with extraordinary news. The box contained a leather portfolio filled with original patent designs, correspondence between the Montgomery twins, and most significantly, financial records showing systematic embezzlement from Montgomery Mills by their business partner, Harold Westbrook. "There's more," the colonel continued. "The portfolio includes a letter from Eleanor to Elizabeth, dated just before the Mills collapse. She discovered Westbrook's theft, but wanted to resolve it quietly to avoid scandal. Elizabeth disagreed. She wanted justice. They quarreled, and Eleanor left for London. By the time she returned, the mill was in receivership, and Elizabeth had suffered her first heart attack." Miss Marple thoughtfully absorbed this information. The poisoning, she now realized, might not have been deliberate at all. An elderly woman, overcome by emotion at confronting her family's destroyer, might easily confuse similar-looking containers, especially if her eyesight was poor. As she prepared for bed, Miss Marple reflected on how the threads of the past had woven themselves into the present. Tomorrow would bring new revelations, she was certain. The pattern was becoming clearer, but the final design remained to be revealed. Like the intricate twin stitch itself, this case required careful attention to each element before the whole could be properly understood. Chapter 5. The Secret Message. Lady Westbrook's recovery had progressed sufficiently by Thursday morning for Dr. Haydock to permit extended visitors. Miss Marple arrived at the Blue Boar to find the judge sitting in a wing chair by the window, a tartan blanket across her knees despite the mild spring weather. The morning light revealed new lines in her face, as though the burden of long-held secrets had finally begun to show. "You've been very persistent, Miss Marple," Lady Westbrook observed as her visitor settled into the opposite chair. "I suppose you want the whole truth now." "Only what you feel able to share, my dear. Though I've found that truth, like knitting, often becomes tangled when we try to hide parts of the pattern." Lady Westbrook's fingers plucked at the blanket's fringe. "I recognized the twin stitch immediately when Mrs. Hartley's shawl was displayed. It was like seeing a ghost, that distinctive way of carrying the yarn over, the precise tension required for the pattern to emerge. I hadn't seen it in over 40 years. Not since you were a young assistant at Needlecraft Monthly? Yes. I was 22, fresh from secretarial college, thrilled to be working in publishing. When my father brought in that pattern, claiming he'd acquired it legitimately from a defunct mill, I knew something was wrong. The original correspondence was in Elizabeth Montgomery's handwriting. I'd seen her letter to the magazine proposing a feature on innovative wartime knitting techniques. But you remained silent. To my eternal shame, yes. Father was persuasive. He spoke of family loyalty, of how the Montgomerys were finished anyway, how the pattern would be lost forever if we didn't preserve it. I was young, afraid of losing his approval. By the time I understood the full extent of what he'd done, it was too late. Elizabeth was dead, Eleanor had vanished, and the lie had become truth in everyone's minds. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. And when Mrs. Hartley submitted her entry? I knew it had to be connected to the Montgomerys. The execution was modern, but the foundation was unmistakable. When I saw her at the tea reception, I recognized Eleanor's features in her face, the same determined chin, the way she held her hands when nervous. I asked her to meet me that morning to discuss the situation privately, but Eleanor came instead. Yes. She must have intercepted my message to her grandniece. When she walked into my room, it was like stepping back in time. She's in her 80s now, but those eyes, grey like storm clouds, hadn't changed. She said she'd been waiting 40 years for someone to acknowledge the truth about the twin stitch. Tell me about the tea. Lady Westbrook closed her eyes briefly. She was so composed at first. We sat at that little table, and she poured tea from the service I'd ordered. She spoke about Elizabeth, about how her sister had died believing justice would eventually prevail. Then she produced a small packet from her handbag, what I thought was sweetener. She added it to my cup, saying it was a herbal mixture for clarity of memory. But it was foxglove. I don't think she meant to poison me. When I began to feel ill, she was horrified. She kept saying, "This isn't right. I only wanted you to understand." She tried to help me to the bed, but I collapsed. The last thing I remember was her voice, frightened and old, saying she had to find Eliza. While Lady Westbrook rested, Miss Marple paid a visit to Inspector Slack at the temporary incident room he'd established in the village hall. The inspector was poring over the documents Colonel Bantry had sent from Yorkshire. Fascinating reading, Slack admitted grudgingly. These financial records show Harold Westbrook systematically drained Montgomery Mills's accounts while blaming wartime shortages for their difficulties. But there's something else. Look at this. He handed Miss Marple a yellowed envelope marked, "For Eleanor, to be opened only if something happens to me." Inside was a letter in Elizabeth Montgomery's careful script. "My dearest sister, if you are reading this, then my worst fears have been realized. The twin stitch pattern we created together was more than just a new technique. It was our future, the key to saving everything Father built. I've hidden the complete documentation where Westbrook will never find it. The pattern published in magazines is incomplete. The true innovation lies in the final rows, which I've encoded separately. Only someone who truly understands our work will be able to decipher it. Remember how we used to hide messages in our knitting as children? The shawl I'm working on contains the key. Trust no one connected to Westbrook. The truth will emerge, stitch by stitch. Your loving sister, Elizabeth." Hidden messages in knitting? Slack looked skeptical. Sounds like something from a penny dreadful. Not at all, Inspector. Knitting has been used to convey coded messages for centuries. During the war, the Belgian resistance used knitted items to pass information about troop movements. A knit stitch might represent a type of train, a purl stitch another. Dropped stitches could indicate timing. Miss Marple studied the letter thoughtfully. I wonder, Mrs. Hartley's shawl was taken when she fled, but we have photographs from the competition. They examined the images of the winning shawl with fresh eyes. Miss Marple borrowed a magnifying glass, studying the complex lacework pattern. There, she said finally. Do you see how certain stitches break the regular pattern? They appear to be mistakes, but they're too deliberate, too carefully placed. I see variations, but what do they mean? I believe we need to map them out. Each variation might represent a letter or number. The question is, what system did the Montgomery sisters use? The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Bennet from the wool shop, having heard about the investigation's new direction, arrived with an old book from her personal collection. The Secret Language of Needlework, Codes and Ciphers in Textile Arts. My grandmother gave me this, she explained. During the Great War, women used knitting patterns to send messages to prisoners. See here. The Montgomery twins might have used something similar. Working through the afternoon, Miss Marple and Mrs. Bennet mapped out the deliberate errors in Mrs. Hartley's shawl pattern. Using the book as a guide, they assigned letters to specific stitch variations. Gradually, a message emerged. Amelia, new father, complicit bank box. 17. Proof inside justice for Elizabeth. Amelia knew, Miss Marple murmured. Lady Westbrook knew about her father's crimes even then. Inspector Slack immediately telephoned headquarters. We need to locate Eleanor Montgomery and Mrs. Hartley urgently. This isn't just about stolen patterns anymore. We're talking about fraud, possibly embezzlement on a massive scale. As evening approached, Colonel Bantry arrived with more documents from Yorkshire. Among them was a faded photograph of the Montgomery twins in their youth, standing proudly outside their mill. The resemblance to Mrs. Hartley was unmistakable. There's something else, the colonel reported. The Yorkshire police found Eleanor Montgomery. She's been living in a care home near Harrogate under her married name. Eleanor Hartley. Her granddaughter Eliza has been her only visitor. Then who visited Lady Westbrook? Miss Marple asked sharply. That's just it. Eleanor Hartley suffered a stroke 6 months ago. She can barely speak, and certainly couldn't travel to St. Mary Mead. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. If Eleanor Montgomery hadn't poisoned Lady Westbrook's tea, then who had? And why had Lady Westbrook been so certain of her visitor's identity? Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily as she processed this new information. Inspector, she said finally, I believe we need to return to the Blue Boar immediately. Lady Westbrook may be in more danger than we realized. As they hurried through the darkening village streets, Miss Marple's mind raced. The pattern was nearly complete now, but like the twin statements, she gestured to the papers spread across the table. Your Aunt Elizabeth didn't die of a broken heart, as the story goes. These medical records show she was poisoned, slowly, over months. The symptoms were attributed to grief and heart problems, but looking at them now with modern knowledge, are you saying someone murdered her? Eleanor Winters asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm saying that my father's crimes may have gone far